A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We are back talking God, Christians and money, in light of the fact that we have a snapshot of Australia's economy based on last week's federal budget. But we are always interested in the sort of context that we exercise godly wisdom around our personal finances and the fact that all of us perhaps at some point have some levels of debt, or you're in charge of running a small business, or you have some investment that you're hoping is going to be enough for your future. Well, we're leaning in today with a focus on those who may be thinking of their future, and that word retirement comes to mind. And that for you may still be a long, long way off. You're thinking that could be a good 20 years away. Or you might be thinking, that's something I'm moving to right now. Or it may be something that you're thinking, well, hang on, I'm already in retirement. What does it all mean for me as we talk about these things? Well, we'll be looking for real biblical wisdom on principles that guide our planning for the future. And sometimes we call that stewardship. Alex Cook is back with us, former stockbroker. He's been a successful financial planner. He's the founder of Wealth with Purpose. He has a ministry to help equip Christians like you and I to honour God with our finances by teaching sound financial skills. Alex Cook, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Great to be back again for another month.
Yes. Hey, it's only last week we had you as part of our panel, and you know what? We were unpacking a conversation about Australia's economy based on the Treasurer's delivery of the federal budget, and you know what? That is available for podcast for listeners who want to hear that, either the audio podcast on the 2020 page or on the Vision app, and there is also the video of that conversation to watch. And I've got to say, that was one of the most outstanding insights with our panel of finance experts around Australia's economy. So my encouragement to listeners is to have a little look at that. Let's come back to outlooks, Alex. And in light of the budgets, in light of the fact that we've been talking about rough times ahead globally, what do we think of as a context-placing idea of where we're headed?
Yeah, look, I mean, you know, I've spoken over the last month or so just about the fact that there is a lot more uncertainty out there. I think really since Trump's come in, the world has, you know, he's upsetting the world order, so to speak. And to be honest, I think that's not a bad thing. A lot of it, what he's doing is very good for long term, but it's like anything, short-term pain, long-term gain. And certainly when you've got his what appears to be very on-again, off-again type style policies, particularly with the tariffs, that leads to a lot of uncertainty. I mean, imagine you're the CEO of a corporation and, you're trying to plan your supply chain, it's very difficult to do so if you don't know what tariffs are coming and going and how long they're going to be there for. You don't know how your own country's going to retaliate. So it is a very complex environment for business. And I guess the two interesting surveys that have come out, in the past couple of weeks from the US, but I think really they're reflective of elsewhere as well, is consumer confidence has taken a dive in the US. It was reasonably optimistic when he first got elected. And then the other thing is business confidence has also dived as well. That's not necessarily, I think, a criticism of his policies. It's more just, I think, that people are now putting their hands up saying, well, we don't know what it's going to look like and how it's going to play out. I think, therefore, there's sort of an inevitability, though, that America will likely go into recession, even though their economy's been much stronger than ours over the past couple of years. But certainly I think there's probably an inevitability, and certainly a lot of the data points are now showing it is slowing down pretty quickly. But that also has some positives. I know people immediately panic, but if you look in Australia where our economy hasn't been very strong for quite a few years, inflation now is coming down. So that's a good thing. I think it's about 2.7%. Rates are falling, which is going to be beneficial for those with mortgages. So it's not all bad. There's often, offsetting factors in the economy. So, yeah, I think it's just going to be a period of uncertainty. And I think the wisdom side of it is because the future is unknowable. You can listen to someone like me, but at the end of the day, I don't know the future. But you can prepare for it. The proverb says a sensible man prepares for, looks for problems ahead and prepares to meet them. The simpleton never looks and suffers the consequences. So it's pretty useful, wisdom. Prepare accordingly. So.
And, if there was a little, positive outlook, and who knows whether it's just spin, but there's some possibility that the US, Donald Trump is saying he might go a little bit easier on Australia so far as those tariffs. So it all comes down to having a perspective here where you can try and cut through the spin and recognise what economic principles have to be prepared for. And even if the times ahead are good, I'll get George's perspective on this. Even when the times ahead may actually look okay, and that's not where the indicators are, it's always best to be planning that things are not okay. Is that a fair enough way to think about a defensive strategy?
Oh, 100%. And I say to people, you want to think defensively and offensively. In the defensive sense, like if we talked about preparing, for most people, particularly those that are employed, as opposed to being self-employed, it's always wise to have a rainy day fund, to have, I always say to people, you want to have about 6 months worth of living expenses in reserve. And I think that's sensible whether times are good or bad, because you don't know how your particular organisation might be doing, and you don't know what plans or what government legislation may come along and derail it. So it's always sensible to have those kinds of foundations in place. And I always say to people, look, the simplest way to protect your finances is just to do it God's way, because you'll actually minimise the pain. It's not to mean, Christians are not they're not set free from burdens of the world and problems of the world. We're not set free from it. But if we do things God's way, you're increasing the probability significantly that the things are going to go well for you. That's just the reality of it, because God's ways, they work. They're sensible. And I think also when we honour God with the way we do things in the integrity we have with money, the generosity we have with money, God honours that and looks after us. So I think there's nothing better that you can do than align your finances with God's word. To me, it's eminently sensible.
I imagine that there's going to be differences person to person. Some think very short term, some think along the medium term, and others have got a lifelong context of where they want to be at the end of their life. And I guess that brings into play what you might be doing in your middle years in anticipation of a long-term strategy. Or as I mentioned in the introduction, if we talk about times around retirement, some will be on retirement age and some are already in retirement and wondering, did I do it right or can I change things now? Let's talk retirement here, because biblical foundations is even using that retirement time a biblical place to start, because sometimes we think of 65, 67, it might even be going up. Is this a good sort of milestone to be helping with your planning?
With planning, certainly. But look, I say to people, retirement's not a biblical concept. The Bible's silent on it. And throughout most of history, the vast majority of people have really worked until they've dropped. It's really only in probably the past sort of 50 years when retirement has become, a thing that they advertise on TV. So the world has changed, I think, in that sense. But to me, and particularly from a Christian perspective, it's not so much an issue as to whether you retire. It's that you live every day on purpose and that you steward your time well. So whether you go to work for money or whether you go and do volunteer work or get involved in various ministries once you've ceased employment, the reality is we should get up every day on purpose and live it for God's kingdom. That to me is something that you do irrespective of age. And if you're fortunate enough in retirement, you probably just got more time where you can choose to sow into things that are more kingdom orientated than perhaps you are able to during your working life. As I say, the Bible doesn't talk about an age or anything. I mean, some people might love reading the book of Numbers, where for those who like reading some of the more challenging parts of the Old Testament, where it talks about the Levites ceasing work at age 50. I think some listeners might be thinking, 50 would be a pretty good age to retire. Sadly, I think if you look at the context of the particular passage in Numbers, it's got nothing to do with any of us in the modern day world retiring at 50. But nonetheless, as I say, to me, I would encourage Christians to really prepare for retirement in the financial sense, but throw out the sort of Western world view of retirement and ask yourself, how are you going to live your latter years for God? What's that going to look like? How are you going to spend your time? I think too much of the world has actually crept into the church in this area, because I obviously talk to a lot of Christians and how they think about retirement. And often I find the goals are very similar to what I would hear from someone who doesn't share our faith would say, basically along the lines of travel and family time. And inherently, there's nothing wrong with either of those things. But to me, the heart of the matter for a believer is, how do I run my race for Jesus until the end? How do I do that? What's it look like? And if I've got more time and more money, how am I going to do that differently to when I had a mortgage and, I was raising a family? It's a wonderful opportunity, I think, to steward your time really well in those latter years and do it for God's kingdom.
And it brings to us all individually this balance between what happens with our finances and what happens with our faith. Because if you don't start these things when you are young, sometimes it's hardest, I imagine, to get through to the heart and mind of a young person to be a steward around finances, because what you do when you are young may well be preparing you for a fruitful future. Is that a fair enough way of saying, there's a time to be thinking about your finances, and it's not when you get old. It's not when you are in retirement. It's when you're young.
100%. 100%. Look, I mean, I would say to someone, as soon as they finish school, they should start saving for it. I think this is just the reality of life. I'm 49, and I think I pick on my eldest daughter, right? She's 16. She thinks of as a 49-year-old as ancient. Yep. But all of a sudden you wake up one day, Neil, and you're 49. And you go, how on earth did I get here? And so the reality is, when you're young, you just don't, you think you've got all the time in the world. That's what you think. The reality is, of course, it creeps up very, very quickly. So I would say to young people, look, go back to what you learned in 5th grade maths, where they talk about compound interest. And if you start saving the moment you walk out of school or out of university, and just put a little bit aside every month, and in fact, the Bible actually uses the expression that says you gain wealth little by little. So if you do that, the moment you enter into the workforce and set some aside, for monthly saving, you'll end up with plenty of money by the time you get to retirement, and then you'll be in a wonderful position, I think, to be able to give away in retirement. Because a lot of people, I think, become very conservative in retirement and quite worried because, they're all of a sudden living on a fixed income, relying on assets rather than their job. And so they become a bit nervous about their giving, and their giving drops. But if you've, built up wealth little by little over the course of your lifetime, you could be in a wonderful position to, bestow wealth on Christian organisations and be able to steward your time more effectively. So, starting younger, to your point, it works.
This is 2020 with Neil Johnson, helping you make sense of life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision Christian Radio.
Our talkback line open, and 1-800-316-316. If you've got a contribution to our conversation today, it's really using that retirement milestone, giving us context for where we might be in our own walk with God, and talking about finances and the future. And Alex, I mentioned that Deuteronomy 8:18 is today's verse. for the Word for Today devotional, and lots of listeners will have actually looked at that, read the Word for Today. It's a great one. One of the things that comes out of that, of course, is if you read Deuteronomy chapter 8, you get the impression that God wants us to know that what we have is His. And if we don't acknowledge that, actually it's our downfall. If we do acknowledge that, it's our prosperity. Any thoughts from you around that passage?
Yeah, well, look, I just love that first part where it says, remember the Lord, because that's where wealth comes from. I think one of the dangers that the Bible paints about wealth, because when you think about wealth is just simply a tool, but I think with Scripture, it paints this idea that money, particularly if you fall in love with it, can take you away from God. And so that's why I think it says, remember the Lord, because it's really His ability, His provision that's given you the wealth, not you. And so I think Christians should always be very humble. And as I say, the risk to your faith is not that, as I say, having money per se is not bad. And I think we probably all want, most people want a bit more money. But the reality is that I think God in many cases can actually withhold money from us to protect us from ourselves and what it might actually do to us. Because as we gain more, we need to be grateful, we need to be content, and we need to remember it's actually from Him and for Him, for His kingdom, not for our own. So it's a great passage there in Deuteronomy.
Because the Israelites coming into the promised land, God was saying to them, you're going to be in this land flowing with milk and honey, and remember not to forget the Lord your God and where all of these things have come from. Let's talk about that and how we might find context for ourselves, honouring God. This can happen at any point, no matter how old we are right now. Honouring God is one of those things that we might look to for a future in honouring God. Sometimes we're thinking of honouring God, Alex, when somebody gets up to deliver an offering message at our local church, and some will say, oh, here we go again, asking for money. And this idea that money is a part of honouring God, sometimes we miss that, don't we?
Well, absolutely. I would say that using money is an act of worship. I mean, if you consider the idea that every cent is actually God's in the first place, then by default, all money is really spiritual, and we need to honour God with His money. I mean, He's expecting that we will steward it and get a return on it. Now, not necessarily, obviously, a share market return, but I would say an eternal return on the money that He's put in our hands. And so we want to honour God with it, and that may look different for us based on our different stages of life. Even if you're retired, you can still honour God with your money and with your time and with your talents. So it's critical, and I think honouring God is a critical part of Christian faith, but very much so with our money. Often, we kind of put money in a little box. We don't want to think about it too much. But the reality is, it's a critical part of our faith, and living generously with it and honouring God as such by being generous.
65, 67, retirement age, as it's like a stake in the ground. So if you're getting into your retirement, let's talk about those who are into retirement years. As you've said, retirees honour God, and sometimes in different ways. When you retired with your nest egg maybe a few years ago, you didn't anticipate there'd be inflation that would be affecting the cost of living, and everything's gone up, and maybe you're wondering now, I don't have enough to be generous in the way I'd hoped I could be generous. You mentioned that there's other ways, the idea of volunteering and mentoring. Any thoughts around that? Because the way we give to God from what He's given to us is bigger than just what our bank balance looks like.
Oh, 100%. In fact, I love Psalm 71. Now, I haven't got it in front of me, so I'll paraphrase it for listeners. But basically it says, even when I'm old and grey, God, do not forsake me, but help me to proclaim your might to the generations who come. And so to me, what a wonderful thing for grandparents to be able to pass on their faith to their children and their grandchildren. So, and often grandparents can be in the front seat with doing exactly that with the kids and with their grandkids, because they now do have more time. Now they can do it through their own family and disciple their own family, or they can do it in the context of ministry, volunteering in their local church, and being, the wise person in the church that's passing it on to future generations. The reality is, when you are older, to me, the critical thing is staying active and being involved in your church and missions and all of those kind of things. I often say to clients, the longer you work, the longer you live. In other words, working is healthy. But when people hear the word work, they immediately assume that I'm just referring to money, right? But if you think about just the 7-day creation, God worked for 6 days and then he rested. We are designed to work, and what that work may look like in retirement is just going to be different. But as long as you get up with the view, I've got a purposeful day ahead that I want to make the most of for God's kingdom. That's what retirement should look like.
Okay, taking calls 1800 316 316. Let's hear from Sam in Kew in Melbourne. Hey Sam, welcome.
G'day, good morning. Yes, and it's still morning.
It is.
Neil, I enjoy your program. I have a question. Look, I'm 74. I'm sort of semi-retired. I'm still working a little bit. I have put some money aside. Excuse me. However, sometimes I get a little bit anxious because the money just is going away all the time. That's why I'm working, because of the cost of living. It's going up all the time, enormously. I didn't plan on all of this when I was planning my retirement. So, I do go to church. I contribute to church. I go to prayer groups. Perhaps my faith is not rock solid, but I'm trying, Alex, and I'm not exactly sure. I'm not on the age pension because I have an investment property, and that's over the asset limit. So therefore, and I have a holiday home, so the land tax is quite a bit. You probably know all about that, I'm assuming. So... I don't know.
Sam, plenty for us to work there, and mindful of news coming up. Your response here, Alex, for Sam.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's a lot of things probably to unpack there in terms of, providing and so forth. But on one hand, I actually quite like your model. I mean, you say you're working, you're semi-retired, so you're doing a bit of work as well as still being very actively involved in church and so forth. That to me is actually, it's healthy. You're actually doing both. As I say, I often say to people, potentially, to keep working, particularly if A, you enjoy it, B, if you feel called to it. Your work is your ministry. It doesn't matter what age you are. Work in and of itself is ministry activity. We often think of pastors and churches as ministry, but so is working. And so there's lots of things you can do in retirement while still working and earning money and taking the pressure off your retirement savings. You did touch on, though, the property issue and the land tax issue. That to me is it's a big problem in Australia in that the property prices are often high, but the income streams from them are low. So, for example, you could have $1 million property that, generates 30 grand or 40 grand's worth of rent, but when you take out all the expenses and the insurances and so forth, you're only left with 20 grand out of $1 million, off $1 million. So your yield's only 2%. If you had it in another asset and other asset classes that are more liquid, you could probably double the income, and then therefore maybe work less. But also, if you've got those other assets, you might be able to slowly liquidate those assets in order to do your giving. So, so there's other ways of, I think, thinking about it with those properties.
Sam, I hope we've been able to extend a little bit of wisdom in there, and I want to appreciate you very much for calling through and just sharing that scenario, because I'm sure there's lots in that same boat. I'm in retirement. I've even got an investment property. I might even have a number of different investments, but somehow or other, those don't even seem to be working for me in this cost of living crunch. What are your thoughts around the fact that there are lots of Aussies right now that might be asset rich because the value of their home has gone up, but they might well be very cash poor?
Yeah, it's a very common phenomenon. I mean, you could live in a $2 million house, but be on the age pension, right? So you're asset rich, but cash poor. But equally like that, previous listener, Sam, where he was talking about, he had an investment property and so forth. There's a couple of challenges. One is obviously the income that your assets themselves are generating. And whilst property has been a stellar investment over the last 30 years in capital growth, it doesn't necessarily pay great income and often has other expenses and hassles associated with it. But the other thing is the income that it gives you in retirement is taxable income, unlike superannuation. And what people often don't realise about superannuation and why it's so attractive, I often joke with people, superannuation is kind of like the ultimate tax haven, right? When you retire, your superannuation as a vehicle becomes tax-free, and the income that you receive from your superannuation is tax-free. So when you think about retirement and when you're planning for it, you need to structure your finances in such a way that it's tax efficient. And in Australia, it's very easy to do that and to do it legally. You don't have to do anything sinister. And as Christians, we want to give to Caesar what is Caesar's. And so we can do it all very honourably, but structure your finances so that you get the income that you need and also accessibility to the capital because, throughout retirement, you're going to have to do things, You might have to upgrade your car. Maybe you're going to get hit with big health expenses at some point. So you do need to have liquidity as well. And so sometimes the assets we hold are all locked up, if you like in real estate, and therefore not easily accessible. So we need to think about that asset mix carefully and the tax efficiency of our finances in retirement. And look, I would just encourage all listeners to seek counsel, seek advice from a Christian financial advisor and find out how to do these things effectively. And because you'll be able to do good things like give more as well once your finances are structured correctly. So,
I know there'd be some saying, well, I've got a financial advisor, never says he's a Christian, or she might never says she is a Christian. Values are different. There's not a lot of perhaps people around with an Alex Cook level of financial wisdom with a godly aspect there, but you've got to look for those Christian financial advisors because their values outlook for your financial future may look a little different to another one who is interested only in a secular way of looking at finances. Are there some particular biblical foundation principles that can guide the Christian as they're looking at investing and looking for a long-term, retirement and beyond?
Yeah, look, in terms of principles, to me, a couple of things I'd say people need to have in order, right? So one of the questions I always ask people when they're talking about retirement is, what does retirement look like for you? In other words, what do you see yourself doing? Are you going to be, you're going to stay locally and, live a fairly modest lifestyle? And, just get involved in your local church, that kind of thing? Or are you going to be travelling more? Or have you got family that live overseas or interstate? So you have to work out what life is going to cost you in retirement. So that's step one, right? Work out what it's going to cost you. Step two then becomes, okay, well, if I know what it's going to cost me, how much do I need to work towards? How much what I call your target capital? How much do you need in retirement to get you that income that you require in retirement? Now, that may mean for some people that they have to work a little bit longer or work part-time if that capital is higher than what's achievable. And I guess the third part to it is, well, how much do I need to save in order to get there? So they're the three component parts that you need to think about. But really, at the end of the day, in order to get there, it just involves the classic need to save and spend less than you earn. Most of us, one of the good things about Australia is we have compulsory super, and you can talk about the pros and cons of compulsory nature of it. But the good thing is most Australians by default have much more money in superannuation and for retirement had they not had it taken from them compulsorily by, as part of their employment. And so once again, we we have this wonderful opportunity to save, spend less than what we earn, to work towards retirement. But there's a couple of things you've got to be careful along the way. You know, you need to make sure you live generously. It's not about just squirreling every cent away for the future, because the Bible makes a very clear distinction between saving and hoarding. Yes, saving for the future is eminently sensible, but hoarding is dangerous, and hoarding, you know, means that money is not going to be used wisely and used for God's kingdom. So there's always a balance to be had with these kind of practices as we're working towards retirement. And of course, the other thing is to try and achieve being debt-free by retirement. I always say to people, you want to aim to ideally own your own home and then have enough capital to derive an income stream from. So if you think in that sense, you want to be debt-free with your own home, but saving enough capital so that you can fund an income in retirement, whether it's through superannuation or through other assets. So there's some of the, you know, Neil, I guess the key issues. But keep it simple, you know, just work out how much do I need and what do I need to save in order to get there, and then automate the process in order to get there. You know, save a little bit, little by little every month, as the Bible says, you know, build wealth little by little.
Now, our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. You can join in our conversation. You might have a question or a comment or your own insight to be able to offer. You know, when we think about superannuation, and we tend not to think about it as much as we should, obviously, and pensions and personal savings and things like that, at what age do you think we ought to be starting to get a really good grip on those? Because sometimes we don't really think of the importance until we're facing down the idea of retirement. What do you think is a good time to start? And is there the sort of available resources for young people to get a grip on that at a young age so they can set themselves up for the future?
Look, it's a great question, and I think probably the challenge in it is that when you think about the goals that you have in life, financial goals like saving for your first home, saving for retirement, saving for kids' education, often those goals have different priority levels at different stages of your life. So to me, a young person should get themselves set up, ideally when they start work, in a low-cost, low-fuss, growth-orientated superannuation fund, and just do that for the first sort of 15 years of their working life, whilst they're working on, you know, the greater priorities at that time, such as raising a family and paying off a mortgage. Because to me, paying off your mortgage should take greater priority than saving for retirement. It's not to say that you shouldn't do both at the same time. I'm merely suggesting that one is a far more important priority. Getting yourself debt-free as quick as you can is much better. So to answer your question, when should it become a bit more of a focus? I would say set it up properly when you're young in your 20s, but then you really need to revisit it in your early 40s when you've got that sort of 20, 25 years left, and ideally you're well underway in paying your mortgage, and you can make really clear plans about getting rid of your debt ASAP and then focusing on building up your superannuation fund in the last 20 years. Because there is one major downside, Neil, to retirement planning for young people, and particularly superannuation, is that when you put the money into a super fund, it's locked away. So, you know, a 25-year-old putting extra money into super, it's locked away until they hit earliest at age 60, if not age 65, depending on various factors. But you don't want to lock away all your money when you're young, when you should be paying off your mortgage.
And I don't want to politicise a conversation like this, but, what comes to mind is that, on both sides, you might, with an election on the way, you might be thinking, there's a policy on the Liberal National side that says you're going to be able to access a certain amount of money from your superannuation to be able to be used as a deposit for a house. And then there's been a lot of scare stuff that's been going on the ALP side of being able to tax top-end people, even superannuation savings. That idea of it being locked away makes us feel secure about super for our future. But when we've got playing around the edges, manipulating our superannuation, that's going to have some big effects on the future. Any thoughts from you around those issues?
Absolutely. So, there's probably a couple of issues there. the Labor Party have a policy that when a super balance hits over $3 million, and this is not yet law as I understand it, but it will soon be passed, that they want to tax unrealised capital gains. Now, that to me is a horrible policy, because at the end of the day, it's unrealised gains. The gains are only gains on paper. They haven't actually been realised. So to me, you only actually make money when you've technically sold it. Everything prior to that is just paper gains. And so that particular policy of the Labor Party is terrible, and I'm amazed from my own industry of finance that there hasn't been more uproar about it, because it's just such a terrible policy. But then if I'd pick on the Liberal Party, they want people to be able to access their superannuation to buy a house. I think it's a horrible policy, because what that means is young people are going to raid their super funds, which means that at the age when they should be building the base inside super that would then compound, they're destroying it to buy a house. Secondly, all it's going to do, and we all know, anyone with an ounce of common sense will know that it's just going to drive house prices up further, because there's more money available, and the banks will be able to lend people more money. So it's not actually going to solve. It may help a few more people into the market, but it's just going to make housing more expensive and even less affordable. I just think neither of the two major parties are serious about housing affordability at all. They talk it, but they're not serious about it, because the reforms are all designed to keep it propped up, not to let it come down. The best solution by far, and the most painful, would be to let house prices fall. We need lower house prices. I always ask people this question: what's the difference between a $500,000 house and a $2 million house in terms of its utility value? And the answer is none. There's no difference. You could have a 4-bedroom house for $2 million, a 4-bedroom house for $500,000, and there's no difference in terms of its utility value. So we need to get prices down so that young people don't have to be slaves for the rest of their life.
I guess,
and so that to me is the solution.
I guess the big difference is,
and there's lots of ways of achieving that.
The big difference is what sort of mortgage you have over the $2 million house as to what you might have if it dropped to $500,000. Hey, this concept, and just to remain with this, because our talkback line's open, but the concept of private ownership. The fact that we can own a house, the fact that we can have a superannuation that someone doesn't have their grubby little fingers into and wanting to take that away, or someone manipulating it so that it won't actually have the desired outcome. When we think of being Christian believers, understanding that private ownership actually is due to our biblical Judeo-Christian foundations, because we can take that back 100%. To, thou shalt not steal. No, you cannot have my superannuation. No, you cannot take the private property that I own. This idea of coveting your neighbour's goods, that you might want to be able to take away from those people to feather your own nest. These things are Christian. These are biblical. We're moving away from these biblical foundations, though. When we start to see these things, we start to recognise that biblical foundations are being chipped away. Any thoughts from you around that?
Look, it's a great. We could have a whole session on this, Neil, because it's a huge one. No, look, private property rights are essential to a free society, and when you take them away, you destroy all incentive. Right? Why would you go to work and work hard to grow a business or do anything if you can't be rewarded for that effort? So it's a disaster, and it's been tried. I always find socialism and communism fascinating, because they get tried over and over again with the same lack of success. But the reality is, I think from a Christian perspective, the Bible is absolutely supportive of private ownership, and then people voluntarily giving it up. If you read Acts, particularly the book of Acts, chapter 2 and chapter 4 also says the same thing, where it talks about the early church, and it says they sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Now, the difference between a society where it's taken by you by force, i.e. in the form of either taxation or just total lack of freedom, that's by force. Whereas the biblical model is that everyone has private ownership with different amounts, and that we voluntarily give cheerfully and part with that money to be a blessing to others. But the private ownership aspect of it is absolutely critical and very biblical.
Taking calls, 1-800 316 316. Let's take another call. Richard is in Alstonville in New South Wales. Hey, Richard, welcome.
G'day, guys. I just want to make sure I'm being respectful here, but what's your take on the Treasurer from the point of view he said a lot in opposition about the budget and about, as you were talking about, like young people being able to afford a home and all that. But when you start to weigh it down, it doesn't seem to weigh up. Like, we seem to be further behind financially than what we were with the last government, even though we had a big deficit.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
How would you put that into context?
Good thoughts, Richard. Alex, Jim Chalmers, an authenticity issue I think I can hear in this.
Well, yeah, there's that. But look, I tend to judge politicians on their policies, not so much on their what comes out of their mouth, because what comes out of their mouth is, it's just the unfortunate reality of modern day politics, which operates on sound bites. A lot of it's just designed to give it, create a reaction and political spin, if you like. To me, the policies is what's critical. And the policies of the last 3 years have dramatically reduced living standards in Australia. We've just had 8 quarters of negative GDP per capita. In other words, living standards have plummeted by pretty much by 50 years. That's how serious it is. And so once again, that's I think because of multiple policies of theirs. One is massive excessive immigration, which is very unfair on renters and people wanting to get into the housing market in general. The energy costs, they said it'd save to $250 a year. It's really up $1,500 in terms of what extra we're all paying. So as I say, to me, you've got to separate what's said and then look at the policies. And in that regard, their policies have led to lower and declining standard of livings for Australians. Will the Liberal Party be any better? I think only mildly. I don't like most of their policies either. I think we need to return. And last week, Neil, when we had Rodson Hill on, he makes this very good point about having a society of human flourishing. You've actually got to reduce the size of government, reduce regulation, reduce the interference in commercial day-to-day transactions. And neither party, they always seem to be just tinkering at the edges. And that's just not real reform. And we're just slowly getting, our standard of living is declining just little by little every year. It's very unfortunate and also completely avoidable in my view.
Richard, anything further to add?
There was another question. This is something that I can't quite get my head around. They've said it before, but if you really look at the reality of it, it doesn't seem to be the case. When Scott Morrison Frydenberg left office, they said that there was a $1 trillion deficit. But my question is, where did the 2.7, was it 2.7? No, $270 billion worth of money that put aside for defence, which seems to have disappeared, come from?
Getting technical here, and time is short. Any response from you, Alex?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that particular defence issue, but certainly, what the government does is it issues bonds, but if there's not enough buyers, then they essentially print it into existence. So during the COVID years, they printed $200 billion of money out of thin air. That's what the Reserve Bank did, which is why we had the inflation that followed afterwards. You can't blame Albo for all of that. That was a lot of it, I think, can be put on Morrison and Frydenberg because of all that excessive borrowing and printing during the COVID period. But yeah, I mean, to me, the issue with that is the lack of sustainability on all those spending policies that both sides of government have. I mean, the budget last week shows 10 years of deficits, and we're already at $1 trillion of gross government debt this year. So it's very unsustainable, and we need to get back to balanced budgets like what we had under the Howard era, and he ran surpluses for some years too.
Richard, thank you so much for your call. Time has run out, Alex Cook, and there's so much more we could be talking about. We'll look forward to our next opportunity to unpack some things like this, and certainly always open to taking listener calls around these sorts of issues, and always appreciate your great wisdom, which has got those biblical foundations that we're encouraging listeners to access. And one place you can access a start on getting some of that wisdom and applying it to your own situation, you can certainly visit the website wealthwithpurpose.com. You can find books, online courses. There's a consulting service too you can access. You can follow Alex on social media. And that could be, you might be thinking, oh, just follow someone on social media, I'm good at that. Well, that might be a way to pick up ongoing financial discipleship. You can access free ebooks, the My Toolkit. There's videos and podcast content, and you can find a lot of that too on the Vision website. Alex Cook, always wonderful getting your insight, and appreciate you so much. Look forward to the next time we get a chance to talk. But for listeners, wealthwithpurpose.com. Alex Cook, thanks for joining us once again today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil. My pleasure.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.